Sloped bind off. So this video is going to be about sloped bind off, and this would be applied when you need to bind off so many stitches at the beginning of a round, such as a sleeve, doing a sleeve cap. Sometimes can happen if you're applying something around the neck and so forth. So what ends up happening, so the instructions for this part of the paisley is that you bind off 2 stitches at the beginning of every round. And what happens is when you bind off 2 stitches, you get a flat spot, then your work goes up. Then on the next round, you would bind off 2 stitches and you'd go up, you'd bind off 2 stitches, and then you get this stair stepping effect all the way around. And I started to do the bind off the regular way as just a regular bind off, doing the 2 stitches. And you can see that I had stair steps here. Then I had done my, this would have been the 3rd row that I did 2. And I thought, well, I know how to do a sloped bind off, so why am I doing the stair step? The difference is that the end result is the same, but the difference is that with the sloped bind off, you get a nice smooth edge as opposed to these stair steps. When you're sewing in the sleeve, you just sew it in, you remove that notch basically by putting it into the seam. And so if you're doing a really good job setting in your sleeve, you don't actually see the fact that there's stair steps in the seam, because you sew it in a way that you eliminate the look of that. The problem is that if you're not super careful about the way that you're sewing in these notches, then you can see a slight pucker sometimes where the excess yarn is in the seam. So to eliminate that, you can do this sloped bind off. So I'm going to show you how you do that. So the way you set this up is you would bind off your first 2 stitches as you would normally. So you knit one, knit the second one, and then you bind off. Okay, so then you, that's one bind off. I flipped 1 stitch so far, and here's the second bind off. I flipped a 2nd stitch. Okay, so that would be the first one. Now I'm going to just knit to the end. So I'm at the end, and in this example I'm going to show you how you do it on both ends, because you'll have to do it in purl as well if you're knitting flat. So we're just going to purl, and I'm going to bind off in the purl. So purl 1, purl the second one, move my stitch, that's the first bind off, purl, that's the second stitch bound off. And of course you would do 3 or 4 or whatever your pattern asks. I'm going to purl over to the other end now. So I purled over to the last stitch on the far end, and I'm going to slip that stitch. I'm going to turn the work, and now this is where the sloping part comes. Oh, I'm trying to do a continental. I'm going to slip the first 2 stitches, and I'm just going to tension my yarn here so that I don't have a big loop. And I'm going to take the first slip stitch, put it over the second slip stitch, so like a regular bind off, except I didn't knit that stitch, I slipped it. And then I'm going to knit the next stitch, so that's the first bind off, and this is the second bind off stitch. And you can see already you don't have a stair step, it's smooth. I'm going to knit over to the end. And I'm at the last stitch. I'm going to slip that stitch just like that. Okay, and now I'm going to go back the other way. Same thing, only we're purling this time. So I just orient my yarn properly. Okay, so I'm slipping the first stitch and I'm slipping the second stitch, and I'm just going to hold my yarn so I don't get a big loopy loop. Switch the pull the stitch over the first one. That's your first bind off. Purl the next stitch, and just as you normally would do in your bind off there. And you can see, I think you can see that there's not a stair step there. Now it's a smooth edge as well. So now I'm going to purl all the way over. Okay, I'm at my last stitch. I don't purl it, I slip it straight onto the needle, the right needle. Turn my work. And I keep wanting to do continental. I will slip the first two stitches on the right side, tension my yarn. I'm going to pull the first slip stitch over the second one. That's your first bind off, knit, and then bind off that second one as you would normally. And you can see that it's still perfectly smooth, not jogging. Okay, so I'm going to knit now, and I will switch to continental knitting for the next one. Okay, I'm at the last stitch. I'm going to slip. Okay, so since I'm on a purl side, I'm going to start with purl, and I'm using continental, but it's exactly the same thing. So you're going to slip. I'm going to bring the first slip stitch over the second one. Just going to keep a bit of tension on this. Then I'm going to purl the next stitch and bind off as normal. And no matter how many you would do, if you're doing 2, in this case I'm doing 2, but if you were doing 3, you would just do a normal bind off. I'm going to purl over to the end and show you what that looks on the other side. And you're going to slip, and you're set up for the next row. So you can see how this looks. It's a thing of beauty. No stair steps, just this nice smooth edge. So when you go to sew in, you'll just find that that's a lot easier to manage. So now I'm going to just do a regular bind off and finish off the swatch, and I'm going to use the same swatch for the next tutorial.